Everyone, Mark here. Today I'm covering how to fly the SimWorksStudios Kodiak 100 in Microsoft Flight Simulator, which is available for both Xbox and PC from the in-game marketplace. I've been thinking of covering this versatile airplane for a while now, but I recently got a message from friend of the channel, Bobby Hunter, who finally convinced me to give it a go. Although this airplane looks like the default Cessna Grand Caravan, it's much more challenging to fly, and there are lots of little subtleties you need to know about, or your flight could come to a very abrupt end. A few of the things I'm going to be looking at in this video are how to start the engine without destroying it, how to do a takeoff that isn't going to result in you veering off the runway or losing control once you're airborne, how to manage the engine's age, and a whole bunch more, so make sure to stick around for all of that. Before I hop into the cockpit, there are a few options that I want to point out from the airplane selection screen. Once I go into turboprops and I select the Kodiak, you're going to see there's 4 different variants of it right here. That's because the plane comes with 2 different sets of tires and an optional cargo pod. The normal tires are what you would use for flights where you're landing on a hard surface, be it concrete or asphalt or anything like that, and you can use them for landing on dirt and grass as well, but it'll be a little bit more realistic if you choose the variant with the Tundra tires configured. In theory, it does result in some small changes to how the flight model works. From what I could tell, it seemed like I had a little bit more friction with the Tundra tires, but it could have just been my imagination. Let's say I pick the Kodiak 100 with the Tundra tires and the cargo pod, and I go into the liveries. And from here, you're going to be able to pick from a few different interior models. You're going to want to pick the one that makes the most sense for your flight, but you're still going to be limited with how much you can actually put in the airplane. Let's launch the sim to have a look at that in more detail. The first thing I do once I'm loaded up into the cockpit is I'm going to go into the weight and balance menu. I'm going to load up the fuel that I need. I've started using SimBrief even for planning for the general aviation airplanes just because it makes it a little bit easier with the fuel calculation. Luckily, I did find a link on flightsim.to with a profile that I can load up into SimBrief, and it also came with a little navmap performance profile as well if you prefer that. And I'll include links to both of them in the show notes. For this flight, SimBrief's telling me I need 812 pounds, so I'm actually just going to bring this down to a little bit closer to what I actually need for the flight at around 422 pounds in each tank. Now, as I'm going to be adding people to the airplane, you're going to notice that the center of gravity is going to start moving, and it's going to start moving backwards because I'm adding more weight towards the back of the airplane. This is the first really important thing you need to know about loading up the Kodiak, and that's that you need to make sure that your center of gravity stays between 14 and 40%. Even getting close to those limits, I found, makes it a lot more difficult to fly, so be aware of that when you're loading up the airplane, either with people or with cargo. At this point, I'm ready to bring the airplane to life, and I have to be careful because this is one of the only engines in Flight Sim where you can actually destroy it on startup if you aren't paying attention. If you do happen to hear some loud bangs and for whatever reason the engine won't start, you're going to have to go back to the world map to reload your flight. Just hitting restart from here won't actually be sufficient to repair the engine. You really do have to go back to the world map to reset it. The integrated checklists that come with the Kodiak are pretty clear about how to start the engine, but I'm going to walk you through the important bits anyways. Speaking of checklists, if you're a subscriber of the channel, you know that I've been creating custom checklists that you can use for the different airplanes in Flight Sim, and I've created one for the Kodiak as well, and I'll include a link to that in the show notes. It's a download that's available for free on flightsim.to. The first few steps of the startup procedure are pretty straightforward. All you've got to do is turn the master switch on, the aviation bus on, and the aux bus on. Once that's done, I'm going to go to the overhead. I'm going to turn both fuel shutoff valves to on. And we're also going to go back to the main panel and we're going to turn the main firewall fuel shutoff to on. This is where things start getting tricky. So what you're going to want to do is make sure that the condition lever is at the cutoff position. You'll also want to make sure that your prop is fettered and that your throttle is at idle. The condition lever is the key part here. If it's at low idle or high idle, you're risking damage to the engine because what's going to happen is too much fuel is going to get into the engine and it's going to cause a massive explosion and the engine literally will explode. Everything here looks good, so the next thing I'm going to go do is I'm going to turn the aux fuel pump to on, I'm going to turn the ignition to on, and now I'm going to turn the starter to on as well. In a few seconds, I'm going to hear and see the prop start up. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to wait a couple of seconds for all of the numbers that are on the multifunction display here to stabilize. While I'm waiting for that, I can turn the generator to on and the alternator to on. Alright, everything has stabilized with the engine now, and the prop is spinning a little bit, so I'm going to move the fuel condition lever to the low idle position. You can hear the engine starting to spool up again because there's more fuel going into it, and you can see it spinning up as well. I'm gonna wait for this to settle down a little bit, and at this point I'm going to bring a little bit of prop in, and once that's stabilized I can just push the prop all the way and you don't have to be too touchy with the prop. Once everything's stabilized, you can go back to the panel here and just turn the aux fuel pump back to standby, and that loud annoying whine is gonna stop. At this point, the engine is up and running and it hasn't caused any damage to it, so I'm ready to continue on with my flight. The only thing you really need to be aware of while you're taxiing around on the ground is to keep the condition lever at low idle. If you put it into the high idle position, it's going to move a lot faster even without any throttle on it, and it's going to be a lot more difficult to control the airplane. While I'm taxiing to the runway is probably a good point to remind you to hit the like button if you haven't already, and to consider subscribing as well. I publish a new video every 2 weeks with tips, tricks, and tutorials for newcomers to the world of flight sim. I've skipped forward a little bit, and at this point there's a few things that I need to configure before takeoff. The recommended flap settings for the Kodiak is 20 degrees on takeoff. However, if you're taking off in a crosswind, you're probably better off with something more like 10 degrees. Now it's time to do the tricky parts. Let's start with the elevator trim. The straight line that's on the elevator trim wheel is meant to represent the current position of the trim. If it's straight up, it means that it's in the neutral position and there's no trim being applied. If the line is facing forwards, that means you've got some nose down trim, and if it's backwards, you've got nose up trim. I saw a rule of thumb online that says what you should do is take your center of gravity, add 10%, and set that as your trim. I found that to be a little bit too aggressive, so instead what I've been doing is I've been setting it to the same value as my center of gravity. For example, in this case my center of gravity is about 28%, so I'm gonna dial in just a little bit less than that. It's still a bit of a guessing game from inside the cockpit as to where exactly you've set the elevator trim, but once you've done it a few times you start to get a feel for where it needs to be based on your center of gravity. Next, let's configure the rudder trim. All single engine props have a tendency to pull to the left, and that's just because the way that the propeller spins, it generates torque and it starts to yaw the airplane to the left on takeoff. But this airplane really does it a lot stronger than any other airplane I've ever flown. You can see the rudder trim position on the multifunction display right at the bottom, and the manual that comes with the Kodiak says that you should use somewhere between 30 to 50% of right rudder trim on takeoff. I find that to be a lot, and I'll usually just set it to the right a little bit, right on the line that's just off the center position, and I'll use my pedals to adjust for the rest on takeoff. Although there's a way to set it in the cockpit right below the throttle quadrant right there, you're going to want to map it to some keys either on the keyboard or on your joystick to be able to adjust it easily, because it's something you're going to have to fiddle with throughout the flight, not just on takeoff. Alright, with all of that set, I'm ready to get going, but there's one last thing I want to explain to you, and that's how to manage the life of the engine. I had to do a fair bit of research on this when I first got started with the Kodiak. I was experiencing weird engine cutouts in flight, and I started looking around in the forums and I saw a lot of people asking about the same thing, and I finally found some answers by going onto the SimWorksStudios Discord server. It turns out that the engine comes with a set number of hours of life to it that's persistent from one flight to the other. As you fly the airplane, that counter is going to slowly continue to increment itself until you get to end of life. But if you abuse the engine in any way, that age is going to increase a lot more rapidly. To show you what I mean, I've turned dev mode on, I've brought up the behaviors window, gone into local variables, and I typed in age in the search box, and you can see right there I have the turbine age displayed. Right now, I've got about 11 hours of life on the engine, and you can see that it's incrementing very slowly just because the engine is idling. If the engine goes into the red on either the torque, the ITT, or the NG, the age is going to shoot up fast, and once I get close to the upper limit of the age, I'm going to start experiencing all sorts of engine cutouts and eventually a total engine failure. There's an update coming to the Kodiak that may already be live by the time this video is published. It's going to make some small adjustments to the impact that wear has on the engine, but the concept is still going to remain the same. I'm going to leave the window open during takeoff so we can keep an eye on it, so let's get airborne. I'm going to gently apply full power, and even though I've set a fair bit of right rudder trim, the airplane is still pulling left a bit, so I'm going to compensate with my pedals just to try and stay on the center line as much as possible. I'm also keeping an eye on the engine. If any of the numbers go into the red on the multifunction display, I'm going to pull back ever so slightly on the throttle to avoid damaging it. Rotation speed comes up quick at 60 knots, at which point I'm going to pull back on the stick to get to about 5 degrees of nose up and build up a little bit of speed, and then I'm going to slightly increase that pitch to probably about 7.5 degrees. At 85 knots, I'm going to bring the flaps up to 10 degrees, and I'm going to dial in some nose up trim so that I can relieve some of the pressure from the stick. And once I'm past 95 knots, I'm going to bring the flaps up completely, at which point I'm going to set my pitch to about 5 degrees and settle in for my cruise climb at around 130 knots. This is also when I'm going to enable the yaw damper, which is going to help keep the rudder lined up properly, and I can start to bring the trim back to center once it's on. At this point, I'll bring the prop back to about 2000 RPM just to make the cabin a little bit quieter. But if I do that without first reducing the throttle, you're going to notice that I'm going to slightly over torque the engine for just a couple of seconds. Whenever you want to lower the RPM of the propeller, you want to first reduce throttle a little bit and then adjust the prop. Now that everything's settling down, let's look at engine damage in a little bit more detail. You can see the age of my engine is still 11 point something, which is pretty good. I'm going to apply a little bit more throttle to force the engine past the red line. And you can see the moment I do that the age of the turbine starts increasing rather rapidly. If I leave the power like this, it really won't be long. I'm going to start experiencing all sorts of engine failures, and before I know it, the entire engine is just going to conk out on me. I backed the power off, and I'm going to close the dev window now since we have a pretty good understanding of what's going on. But the key takeaway here is to remember that every time you make a power change, to keep an eye on the torque, the ITT, and the NG so that you don't cause any damage to the engine. I usually engage the autopilot once I'm established in my cruise climb. I put it on a little bit earlier here. I won't go over all the details of how the autopilot works because I've covered it in detail in another video, and I'll link you to that one in the show notes. In terms of cruise altitudes, I'm going to use something between 4,000 and 8,000 feet depending on the wind and weather conditions, mostly because any higher just feels a little bit inconvenient for this airplane, even though it can go much higher. There isn't much else that needs to be done at cruise other than look at the beautiful scenery around, and I'll usually plan my descent at this point as well. I've skipped forward to my top of descent, and the numbers that I found work well for this is to use 1000 on the torque and leave the prop at 2000 RPM and start around an 800 foot per minute descent. I mostly fly VFR with the Kodiak, but this is the point where I'll brief myself on my approach, and if I were to be flying an instrument approach because the conditions deteriorated en route, I would set it up at this point as well. And once I've completed my descent and I've settled into the traffic pattern, that's when I'm going to put the prop back to full, which is going to bring it back to 2,200 RPM, and I'm going to set the power to about 1,000. I'm going to add power first in this case because increasing the RPM is actually going to cause a drop in torque, which is the opposite of what we saw when we were climbing. This power configuration should get my speed down to about 138 knots, which is the point at which I can put the flaps to 10 degrees and continue on the downwind leg for a normal traffic pattern. You might notice that changing flaps in the Kodiak doesn't have nearly as much effect as it does in some of the default airplanes in Flight Sim. That's because the Kodiak has an automatic trim system that compensates for it a little bit. Give yourself a good 1 to 1.5 nautical miles past the runway threshold just so you have a little bit of buffer if you needed to adjust, especially on the first few times as you're trying to land the Kodiak. Once you do turn on to base stow, you can extend the flaps to 20 degrees, and that's going to continue to slow the airplane down towards your final approach speed. You need to be gentle with the engine as you turn on to final. The plane's really sensitive to power changes, especially if you've got a lot of weight on board. So don't let your airspeed or your descent rate get away from you because it's going to be hard to catch up. You're probably going to need somewhere between 800 and 1,000 pound-foot of torque the whole way down to the ground, and you're going to need a whole bunch of elevator trim to reduce the pressure on the stick too. Once I'm established on final, that's when I'm going to go flaps full, which is going to bring me down pretty close to my final approach speed of somewhere between 70 and 80 knots. The Kodiak's advertised as a STOL aircraft, or short takeoff and landing, which means the plane can land within 1,500 feet after passing a 50-foot obstacle. If you want to do a STOL landing, as soon as you touch down, you're going to apply full brakes, bring in the reverse thrust, and bring the flaps up all at the same time. Don't use full reverse thrust for too long though. I've noticed if you do that the engine age is going to shoot up really quick as well. You should aim to be at around 70 to 75 knots as you're crossing the runway threshold, and as you're getting close to touching down, probably something more like 60 to 65 knots. I only cut the throttle once I'm a few feet above the runway and I'm ready to touch down. If you cut it any earlier, I find the airplane just has a tendency to drop out of the sky. I saw on the forum that they're probably going to be making some changes so that this doesn't happen, so we'll see how that goes with the latest update. So on that note, I hope you learned something useful on how to fly this airplane, and if you did, please make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to get more similar content. I'll see you soon.